Throughout the 1850s to the early 1900s, Native Americans were pushed out of their homes and forced into specific areas of land known as reservations. Before Europeans settled North America, Native Americans existed, ruled, and thrived all over America. The Europeans conquered the East Coast and eventually began to colonize the rest of America. These men believed they should rule over the entirety of America based on a concept known as manifest destiny. This map displays all of the Native American land lost to the colonizers throughout the second half of the 19th century. The map also shows the Native American reservations.
The standard of living on reservations was incredibly low. There was no self-sustaining economy within the reservations. The only way to improve the economy was to trade in other markets, but the infrastructure was run down and useless. This forced Native Americans into poverty. Reservations are examples of institutionalized racism. They take away any means of having success for Native Americans and force them into poverty purely based on their differences.
The reservation system was put into effect with the help of multiple legislative acts. One such act was the Dawes Act of 1887. The act is known as an act to provide for the allotment of lands and severalty to Indians on the various reservations.
The Dawes Act was a system of breaking up reservation land for each man who lived on the reservation. It rewarded assimilation by granting land to Native Americans who adopted white clothing and ways of life. The Dawes Act tried to alienate Native Americans from their culture, and if it was successful and all the Native Americans assimilated, the government would no longer have to oversee Native American welfare. Native Americans were forced into assimilation in order to gain land and to have some kind of economic stability. But in order to reach that economic security, they had to forget a major part of their culture and heritage.
Assimilation for Native Americans meant becoming as similar as possible to white people. To properly assimilate, Native Americans had to change their physical appearance as well as their actions. Instead of wearing traditional clothing, decorating with face and body paint, and having long hair, Native Americans had to model the looks of whites in every way possible. They traded in their traditional tribal gear for suits and ties. They washed off the paint and cut their hair. Full assimilation also meant that Native Americans had to give up their cultural practices.
Assimilation of Native Americans was specifically targeted at children through schooling. One school was the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. From 1879 to 1918, more than 12,000 children from 140 tribes studied at the school. It was started by Henry Pratt, an officer in the U.S. Army. He began the school as a way to isolate children from their traditional customs and transform them using education. Their motto was, "Kill the Indian, save the man." The children were taught to read, write, and learn basic math skills. They were completely alienated from their heritage and traditions. They were taught to be exactly like white children.
Even with all of the combined efforts of white colonizers by legislation or schooling to assimilate Native Americans, they retained their traditions. Most of the Native Americans continued to practice their cultural traditions and customs. One practice they continued to uphold was the ghost dance. The ghost dance was supposed to reunite the living with spirits of the dead, as well as bring peace, prosperity, and unity in times of trouble to the Native Americans. In fact, the practice of this tradition increased with the start of the reservation system because Native Americans used it in times of trouble, and the period of assimilation was definitely a time of trouble. Like Native Americans being forced into reservations, African Americans were pushed to live in neighborhoods with only their race. African Americans were forced into these neighborhoods, like the Black Belt in Chicago in 1941, because of unfair rents in other white neighborhoods. This creates another example of institutionalized racism, where whites forced African Americans into areas and places where they had restricted opportunities to succeed. African Americans were only pushed into these neighborhoods because white people didn't want to live near them based on their skin color. The standard of living in these neighborhoods was extremely low, and it was almost impossible to rise above the neighborhood because of unfair discrimination and job payment. This occurred in cities across the nation in the 1940s and 1950s, and the Younger family and Raisin in the Sun lived in one of these segregated neighborhoods.
Beneatha Younger, the daughter of Lena Younger and sister of Walter Younger from Raisin in the Sun, was constantly fighting the societal pressure to forget her native culture and assimilate into the traditional white American culture. Just as the Native Americans used their ghost dances to continue expressing their culture and to rebel against the white officers ruling over the reservations, Beneath they used the traditional colored robes of a Nigerian woman and records of tribal music as ways to fight back against assimilation.
This choice between societal pressure and longing for a cultural heritage occurred to African Americans throughout the mid-1900s. Like the image shows, women had choices to make, like whether to wear their natural hair or straighten it to appear less unique. Men, women, and children all struggled between assimilation, which would allow more opportunities to succeed, and staying true to their history as Africans. Both Native Americans and African Americans were pushed into inferior statuses by white Americans. They were assigned a race that made them appear to be less than those with white skin and blonde hair. Their races don't actually exist. They were created by social constructs designed to make them feel like less. The social construct of race gave whites power over other, which resulted in the discrimination seen throughout history. Race is the reason Native Americans were kicked out of their homeland, herded like cattle into reservations, and forced into stripping themselves of their native customs. Race is the reason African Americans end up living with only their race in areas where poverty is abundant. It is the reason that African Americans have to choose between assimilation or staying true to their culture. The assignment of race and the creation of an inferior status forces both groups into poverty, into drinking, and into assimilation.